I've been friends with Stephen Schwartz since I was 21 years old. It was just me and him and Stephen Remus. Stephen Schwartz put his hand up. It's like, no, sorry, there's a misunderstanding. Greg is the band.
Let's just talk about the guitar parts for a second.
The only cast members that were hired when I got hired were Cynthia and Ariana. It drove me crazy. I am going to make this work.
Greg Wells, music producer behind the Wicked movie. Congrats on how successful this movie is.
I don't even know what to say. Like, all I know is that me and everybody involved were into it, and you can just never predict the fickle marketplace. You just can't tell. I mean, we had a pretty good, I suppose there was proof of concept because it was a hit on stage for 2 decades, but there's just so many things that can happen that stop something great from connecting. But yes, it's really amazing, and I just think it's such a incredible story. And it's a thrill to play a small part in it. It's amazing.
Did you feel the pressure of the fans who love the musical when you were working on the music? And did you go, oh my God, we have to get this right? Or did you feel isolated that if I'm feeling good, this is all that matters?
Oh, no. Well, I mean, I had to plug into that feeling, as a music maker. I think we all have to, you have to trust your own instincts, or you kind of have no idea how to begin making the food, but absolutely, I did not want to be labeled for all time as the guy that fucking wrecked it. You know what I mean? And I've seen it many times live, and I love it. And I love, I've worked with Idina Menzel. I produced many tracks on her last solo record, and I've been friends with Stephen Schwartz since I was 21 years old. We'd never worked together prior to this, but I really didn't want to. Stephen likes a really tight music team, so it was just me and him and Stephen Remus as the primary kind of. I mean, there were a lot of other people helping us, but in terms of the decision making, music folks, it was just the three of us. And when Stephen Schwartz decided that I should also be the band, the drums, piano, guitar, and bass, then it was like a lot of responsibility on me, and I definitely felt the heat of that.
I want to ask you about that because you're known for being such a great player, but you easily could have pulled in other great players to play drums, piano, bass, guitar, and then you could have had more of a producing role, or you could have played even half those instruments. Why did it feel like the best thing was to have you play all the instruments from a creative standpoint?
It wasn't my idea. In fact, I was hired my job description was to play nothing and to only be the producer and the mixer for the songs. That's what I signed up for. That's what I got paid for.
Were you underpaid on this project for playing all the instruments?
I won't say I was underpaid or overpaid. I will say that I didn't get paid any extra once last February when Stephen Schwartz announced in a Zoom, and he was probably thinking it the whole time. But I just think it was probably a lapse maybe in communication between the executives at Universal, who were the people that, officially, like Stephen Schwartz didn't cut my deal. He creatively hired me. But the people that did the deal assumed that we'd be hiring London studio musicians because that's where we're recording the orchestra, and that's typically what they do on most films that they work on. But I think that maybe I'm just surmising, but I think Stephen has been to my studio several times over the years, and he's watched me go from being, I moved here as a piano student on a Canadian government scholarship. That's when I met him. And he's watched me go from having absolutely nothing going on to a tiny bit of a career to a bit more of a career. And he's met some of the artists I've worked on, and a lot of those records, not all of them, but a lot of them, I wound up being the band because a lot of those productions were born out of songwriting sessions when there's no budget. As a songwriter, I don't get paid to show up on a songwriting session, but I have a studio where all these instruments are set up, and growing up in Canada, I was in a wheelchair for a couple of years as a young. I was like from 11 to 13. So sports were out of the question after that. And I was already obsessed with music, and I just kind of whatever I could get my hands on. But by the way, I never even knew if I was good or not, and I was never told if I was good or not. That didn't matter. I was just obsessed with music, and no one around me did music. Um, so that made it even more exotic. And I would just kind of try to learn anything that was around. And it wasn't until I left my hometown that I realized I actually wasn't terrible at it. And in fact, all that time kind of in my bedroom and joining whatever band I could in my hometown was fantastic practice for what became my career. And so it led to those songwriting sessions led to my career as a record producer. And I guess that's how Stephen Schwartz possibly perceived me and probably perceived my role coming into this. Uh, yeah, it was a bit, I mean, Stephen Aremus and I were like, oh, I see. I remember texting him after that Zoom going, I think my workload just quadrupled, which it did. And, the little boy in me was like, wow, I'm gonna get to drum on Defying Gravity. And, and you know, the 55-year-old in me was like, oh shit, how are we gonna get this done for the orchestral dates, which we cannot move, June 1st at Air Studios. Like we gotta be done. All the rhythm section tracks have got to be finished. It was hilarious and not hilarious pressure. I have a whole bunch of kids, and I wasn't, I was working 7 hours, 7 days a week, 20, it felt like 24 hours a day. I hardly saw my family for a long time, but everyone kind of got it. And um, I think when you see the film, I think you also see the work that everybody put into it. It's really jam packed and Wicked, as you know, because you played on it. You've seen those charts. Like it's not easy music. It's hard. It's really challenging. Um and as you said before, we not just me, but like everybody involved, from the two leads, Cynthia and Ariana, to everybody behind the scenes, we all felt like we cannot wreck this. We have to knock this so far out of the park uh without being unfaithful to what's just amazing about it, but we also want to make it cinematic at the same time.
I labored over Guitar 2 book. It took me so long to be able to play that confidently. But to manage all of the other instruments on top of Guitar 2, for you specifically, let's just talk about the guitar parts for a second. Were you practicing these parts like crazy? And were you referencing the Broadway orchestrations, or were you kind of using that as inspiration and coming up with your own thing? Like, what were you doing? Like, were you shedding this stuff like crazy, or were you kind of just running with it?
I was definitely referencing all the charts and quite often sight reading. Um, and uh, and and I had the benefit of being able to punch in, which I definitely took advantage of on the guitar tracks because my guitar playing is I play guitar on a lot of records, but I'm a much better drummer and piano player than I am a guitar player. Um, so yeah, there was there was plenty of punching in. Um, I also decided to double all the guitar tracks just to make it feel more recordy. Um, I mean, not probably not every track, but a lot of them. Um, and the guitar parts are ridiculous. I think a lot of them are actually they look and sound to me like keyboard parts. I can tell they weren't written by guitar players. And they're really challenging, like just crazy jumps, almost like Alan Holdsworth, sort of like all over the neck. Like my hand should really be, 5 times the size that they are to really nail those parts. So, yeah, plenty of punching in on the guitar. Um, and then sometimes I was very, very, very faithful to the charts. The charts are excellent. And then for some reason on Defying Gravity, my collar is pulled so hard toward that song. And the first time I saw the musical, I mean, a lot of people really connect so absurdly deeply with that song, but the first time I saw it was here in Los Angeles, and an amazingly talented actress named Eden Espinosa was playing Alphaba, and and that moment when, if you haven't seen it before, when Alphaba rises up, it's really just an amazing moment of direction. Um, you know, it's so powerful, and the music just goes into overdrive at that point, and I didn't know what was going on, and the lump in my throat expanded to the size of Jupiter. And then it ended and it went dark and the curtain came down and I couldn't even talk. And my date, I just turned to her and I said, I have to go. And I never saw the second act. I left. I've never told Stephen Schwartz that story, but it hit. I felt impaled. So anyway, on that song, I didn't really look at the charts, um, hardly at all. And I just went for it. Um, the song got changed. There's some new sections in it. Some new music in it because of the way that our director John M. Chu wanted to blow up the narrative and add some kind of reflective moments toward the end. And again, we have the luxury of making things a bit more cinematic, things that you wouldn't be able to do as effectively on stage. So, but even so, that stuff I tried to just use my ear as much as possible. There were a few things I missed. There were some EBow parts. The EBow, those guys are so in love with the EBow, and honestly, I've never played EBow before, so I had to kind of like learn how to make that happen. I was kind of avoiding it, like, and I and then they didn't really ask for it until the end. They're like, "Where's the EBow? What about that EBow? Oh, the EBow." So I had to go to the charts for the EBow stuff. There were some things I missed by not referencing the chart on Gravity, but I really loved the parts, and I really wanted to also, Alex Lockamore is a dear friend of mine who spent 8 years with Stephen Aremus, music directing Wicked, and a lot of his parts are in the charts too. So I wanted him to, and he just saw it a few days ago for the first time, and he called me, and I wanted him to have that experience. I wanted him to go, I heard my parts. Um, we've made 3 movies together, uh, in the Heights, and a really amazing movie called Vivo animated. It's all this fantastic Cuban music, and then we did Tick Tick Boom, and I adore him. And
And Greatest Showman too, right?
yes, that's where I met him. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. We spent less time together in Greatest Showman, but we were like that on those 3 movies with Lynn. Um, and I know that Aremus and Alex really, like, really, really, really dug down deep on those parts, and they're fantastic. There's no point in not having them in there. And if I felt like I could augment something or add to it, I would. And sometimes Stephen Aremus and Stephen Schwartz would say, do your thing. Like, you don't have to stay on script. And in fact, they often encourage me to really go off script, to the point where I said to them, like, are you sure? Like, really, you want me to? Because I worked with Andrew Lloyd Webber in a couple of different things that he's written, and one of the first things that he said to me was, he's like, Greg, I have to warn you, like, I can't really hear it any other way than how I originally had it up and running. Like, I'm just, and I understand that. He's like, I don't really want to hear it differently because it just worked really well the way that we had it for. I get that. Steven Schwartz is almost the opposite. And I didn't know that until he just kept encouraging me. Like, I'd do something that felt a bit indulgent. I'd play like a bass fill that was a bit like, oh, look at me. Um, and I was ready for the note of like, that's too much, take that out. But the note was, that's my favorite thing. Do more of that. Um, and I remember having dinner with the two Stevens and saying, I can't believe you guys are encouraging me to like be sort of like muso moments, like more fills, more bass slides, more crazy drum moments. Like they really pushed me to go a bit more mad on the drums, which as a studio musician for years and years and years, you're really not encouraged to do that most of the time. And Steven Schwartz looked at me. He's like, Greg, you don't get it. Like, I'm so sick of hearing this music. Like this thing, I want to hear it differently. I want it to feel like it has some new legs on it. So, he said, if you do something I don't like, I'm going to tell you, but please, like, continue to like just interpret it and do your thing. And they gave me fantastic direction. I very much produced this with both of them. It's very much a team effort. And I would say including the mix too. I mean, they're not technically mixing. It was me mixing it, but it was with plenty of input from both of them, making me look good.
I was so fascinated about the EBow parts because I was listening to the whole movie saying, are they going to put those in because it's such a weird sound? And I think the only time I really heard it was that those lines in Defying Gravity. But you mentioned it earlier. But was there more pressure to put in more EBow, and did you push against it, or did you think maybe for the movie it doesn't quite fit the same as it does in the show?
I never verbally pushed against it. Mentally, I pushed against it just because I had never played EBow before. I think I was just a bit scared of it. But I bought an EBow many, 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 many months ago, and I just had it sitting on my console, kind of staring at it. Um, it's all there. Everything that's every EBow chart, every EBow part on any chart is you'll hear it on the soundtrack album. Things change when it gets on the dub stage and the director's saying, I need to hear more foot stomps or more explosions or whatever. And my mix, Andy Nelson was very respectful of my mix. I delivered 7-1 mixes, which is how he mixed the movie, 7-1. But, there's also, it's not just a movie mix. It's like all this dialogue and it's other stuff. So I agree. That's the only time I really noticed the EBow as well in the movie mix, but it's all there. I played all of it. And there were
Yeah, yeah.
requests. There were a few things on the chart that I missed, and they're like, "Oh, there's another EBow part. Check it out." Like those guys love the EBow. That's all I have to say.
How important, because I feel like the guitar effects fill the sonic character of the guitar part, but I also think there's a lot that has to do with the sonic character of the show, like the choruses of the guitar, the rotary. I don't know if you used any sequoia at any points in
I
this.
I also bought a Sequoia pedal.
And you had to buy a sequoia pedal. Did you labor over getting the right sounds? Were they plugins? Were they real pedals? Where were they coming from?
I mean, this stuff it came from like 20 years ago, right? Like the Sequoia was new at that point, and people were freaking out, and it just got built into the ecosystem of that sound. Um, we, yeah, like I didn't really know how to make the thing work, and I tried a plug-in version of it, and Steven Reeves was like, "No, that's not it. Like, you need to get the pedal." So I did, and the pedal is sort of mysterious. It's weird, and one of the guitar players on the show very sweetly sent me an audio clip. And I think there was even a diagram, like he took a photo of how he set the pedal up, which was super helpful. And so I got it as close as I could. And um, there's some sequel on there as well. Yes.
When you were working at the beginning of the movie, because you were one of the first people on the movie, you had to create these MIDI arrangements that the cast could sing to. What was that process like? Were you orchestrating everything basically at that point in the computer and you had to get everything on the keys? Talk me through that moment. What was that part of the process like?
It was crazy. I haven't done full MIDI demos since I was the age where I met Steven the first time, 21, with my Mac Plus computer. Uh, we had to build tracks so that they could film the movie to some music, you know? Um, and Stephen Schwartz, rightly so, although I was a bit like, I wanted it to have some real instruments on it, but he said, He's like, no, Greg, it's got to all be MIDI because, to your point, the only cast members that were hired when I got hired were Cynthia and Ariana. That was it. So we didn't know the vocal ranges of anybody else. We didn't know who was even coming on board at that point. I'm sure there was a short list, but I wasn't privy to it. And it was a smart decision because there were so many key changes and so many tempo changes. Um, I mean, every day almost there'd be changes in both of those departments on so many songs. So then I masochistically took it upon myself to make everything sound as real as possible, not just rhythm section elements, but all the orchestra stuff. And it, whatever, this is just my own narcissism, but we actually fooled some conductors. They wanted to know who the orchestra was, and I thought, oh, that's fun. But now when I listen to it, comparing it to Jeff Atmajian's genius arrangements with those badass musicians at Air Studio, I mean, it's just, there's absolutely no comparison. But it was a fun exercise, and it really got me familiar with the arrangements. Um, Bill Brown's uh, orchestral arrangement for the unfortunately Bill's not with us anymore, but his writing is just unbelievable. And I know there was lots of input from Alex and from both Stevens, but Bill was a monster arranger and arranged many iconic shows on Broadway. And it was thrilling to get really up close and really look at them and figure out what made them tick and trying to make it talk that way. Me sight reading on this keyboard, sight reading, bass clarinet parts at 2 in the morning and different clefs. And it was really kind of a bizarre exercise in how far can I push myself.
So,
It was insane,
yeah.
actually.
So step one was you had to recreate the entire score in MIDI. So you're looking at the Broadway orchestrations originally, and you basically are replaying them into MIDI and keeping them as is. And then from there, do they start to adjust and morph into what you needed them to become for the movie? Is that what the next step was?
Yes, yes. I absolutely need to mention Dominic Amendum, who hasn't been on the Wicked um, world as long as Stephen Aremus, but I believe for at least 10 years has been. And he came on as an associate conductor. I think that's the right term. Anyway, he's very close with Stephen Schwartz and Stephen Aremus, and he's done lots of stuff with he produced the Prince of Egypt soundtrack for Stephen Schwartz. Dom is a great piano player and a great musician and great arranger, and so he was also he is part of the music team, and I believe he had a lot to do with figuring out what we needed to use from because the charts didn't always line up with with what was being used in the movie. um and he would supply me with, he'd be like, ignore bar 33 to bar 70, which helped. um or this new section 50 minutes into the movie is actually using music from some a much earlier cue, stuff like that. Roadmap stuff, and kept just kind of helped keep me on track. But yes, it was a lot of I mean, uh I I don't mean this uh boastfully at all, but I'm not sure that anybody else could have done this job because I'm a weirdo. I just have this like a weird. I have a pipe organ in my home, but I also like was obsessed with Black Sabbath and you know as a teenager and like was in a Black Sabbath cover band and in a punk band and I have all this weird experience and I studied jazz at college for 2 years and um I played on jazz records and I have all this classical background and uh went way down a classical rabbit hole, but I've always had an ear for pop music and then I wound up the plan was never for me to become a pop producer. I was producing like Rufus Wainwright and things way more on the fringe. And a songwriter named Cara DiGuardi met me, and we thought we'd be a good fit because I was not doing what she was doing at all. And that kind of wound up, Cara pulled me into the pop area code. And then I wound up working, doing pop music. And then I wound up being perceived as a pop producer, but like I'm really not that pop musician. Um, but all that training, all of that stuff, where I'm going with this is like pulling on all of that experience, to use an organist term, pulling out all the stops for this job. I really had to just draw on every bit of experience. Um, I've had so many different music teachers, arrangement teachers, composition teachers, tons of performance teachers. I've studied orchestral percussion with a guy when I was a teenager who was the percussionist with the Toronto Symphony Orchestra. I've studied with so many amazing piano teachers. And I really, really, really had to like just dig deep, and in a way that I have not had to on any other project. Certainly not on the pop records I've been producing. Every once in a while it'd be fun to like write a string arrangement for something, or uh but I mean, Stephen Schwartz's compositions are deceptively difficult with a capital D, as you know. And then to make it feel, um I mean, it's hard to do with any piece of music, but to have it not be distracting, right? Where you just feel the story, which is really my what I'm going for. I don't want anyone to notice the seams or notice something that I've done or whatever. I just want people to get lost in the music. And it's interesting what's happening now. The movies come out, and it's thrilling that it is such a hit, and the album soundtrack is also quite a hit. And me and the small music team, we're kind of scratching our heads going, why is nobody talking about the music? Like nobody's talking about it. They're talking about every other element, cinematography, the costume design, obviously the acting, the direction, the editing. Nobody is talking about the fact that the music sounds really great. But I suppose that means like we've really done our job. Or it means they hate the music. It's,
Wait, that would drive me crazy though, because the music was the thing I paid the most attention to, but probably because I know the score or the especially the arrangements so intimately. But that to me was the part where I said, "Oh my God, this is the best arrangements I've ever heard in a movie ever."
well, maybe it's geeks like us that we notice that kind of thing. I've had comments from musicians. I suppose I mean like in the press, like my Instagram feed is just inundated with like accolades for literally every other job, like almost down to the parking attendant. Um, and like no mention of Stephen Remus or me. And like anyway, but I think that means that I think that's a good thing.
Isn't
It's a
yeah.
little hard on our ego, but it's a good thing that no one's noticing it. It's just like they're just noticing the characters and the story, and like we're not making solo records. That's what we're here to do.
Isn't the part about Wicked on the music side is that it's an orchestra with basically a rock band in the center of it? Is that kind of how you think of it? Like there's a whole rock band in the middle of the music surrounded by an orchestra. Are those the two elements that have to get balanced with it?
Yeah, I mean, Stephen Schwartz, we were at Air Studios doing the orchestra, recording the orchestra, producing the orchestra, for 2 weeks in June. And I'll never forget somebody in the control room. It's a pretty big control room, and there were a lot of people there. And at the console, um, I was in the middle. Our engineer Nick was right here, and Steven was right here. And somebody, I don't know, someone said, "Ooh, that sounded scary," like some comment on whatever. And Stephen Schwartz didn't miss a beat. He's like, "Well, it is a horror movie, and he wasn't trying to be funny. Like he really views it as that. If you really tear away the not artifice, that's not the right word. It even makes it more insidious that there is, especially in the first act of the live version or the first movie, there is kind of like an almost family entertainment thing going on of this is fun, this is for children, this is, but it's actually really, it's a very tragic story. It's really quite dark, and it's, it's allegorical. Um, it's bizarre. It's about a man trying to kill his daughter. Um, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Where was I going with that?
We were talking about you were talking about being in the studio with Steven, who was saying this is a horror film, so it should be scary. It should
Yes.
be
So,
impactful.
to your question, talking about a rock band in the middle of an
Yes.
orchestra, certainly on Gravity, that is what it is. I mean, when it kicks into gear, I think it was like 12 guitars I had going, double tracked through various amps. Like I have this beautiful uh JCM 800 that's kind of darker sound. He records beautifully. I had a bunch of those like Les Paul going through that, and then I have this Supro amp that I love, and I have a Friedman amp that I love, and I went nuts, like just tons of guitars. Then I have this old Fender 6, the Fender 6 bass guitar,
Yep.
this
Yeah.
old
Yeah.
Nashville thing. Then I ran that through a Marshall and was playing the low, crazy bass notes. You can hear it on Gravity. It's kind of out of tune, but it makes it growl. And I really like went stuff I would probably only do with a proper rock band. Um, uh, and then even more weird, distorted stuff. Double tracking bass guitar, maybe triple tracking bass guitar with distortion. Not every song is a rock band, but I think where I was going with bringing up Steven saying it's a horror movie, his compositions really do go from like Sentimental Man, which has a sort of vaudevillian soft shoe dance section in it in the movie, to Popular, to the opening overture, which almost sounds Wagnerian, or like Beethoven or both. It's brilliant writing, but he's just full of surprise. He's a great piano player, and he can really authentically go to so many different places. He's almost like I mean, he's an incredibly intelligent, very well read, very curious person with very high antenna. And, he was friends with Leonard Bernstein. I mean, he's that guy. And he can rock. I mean, like when we were mixing Gravity, the first time the chorus comes in, when she's singing kind of quietly, it's like right as she's like something has changed within me is that moment, and then she goes to leap, I think I'll try that moment. He's like, okay, let's stop. He said, how do we give this more teeth? And there's really no teeth at that point. It's everything kind of light. I'm just like on the ride cymbals, just grabbing accents. But I did play some sort of like, I had bass with like kind of a light octaver on it. It's like, "Brum, brum." And he loved that. He loves bass slides. So he's like, turn that up when it slides. So if you hear it, it does it in the movie too. If you listen on the soundtrack, there's like kind of a sinister thing happening. And then I had some distorted guitars doing it kind of quietly. He's like, turn them up a little bit. He's like always looking for the kind of like the scary element. Like I don't think he's looking for like that kind of rock, but it's more like the ominous, the wicked part.
So what was the next step after you make these MIDI tracks that then get shipped off? And then was the next part for you then after the movie was made and you're in the studio with the orchestra, or what was the next step for you?
No, I was on this full time since I started in July 2022. Um, I got an email from Steven in June of 2022 asking, actually, we were emailing about something else, um, about an amazing artist that I work with named Jake Wesley Rogers. And I'd written a song with Jake and I thought Steven should hear it. And I sent it to him and he was replying to it. And the last paragraph was, oh, by the way, I'm putting together a team to work on the music for Wicked. Would you be interested in it? So anyway, so we got on the phone and then a couple of weeks later I was working on it. And then I was working on it for a couple of months here in LA. And then Universal built a studio on the film set in London, a pretty nice studio and pretty big, for me and the music team and for the two leads, so that while they were rehearsing, they had not begun filming yet. Um, that they could, the idea being we don't need to go into London because they were shooting at Elstree Studios, which is about 30 minutes north of London. It just made sense to like spend some money, build a studio there. They could just dip in and do a thing or whatever, and then go back to rehearsing whatever they were rehearsing. Um, and then I wound up going over there for 2 months. Um, and we wanted to make a version, like a rehearsal version of all the songs for both movies. So I've done like really convincing MIDI mock-ups of all the songs for movie one and movie two, which was a just Herculean amount of work. Um, but I am going to answer your question. We're still in MIDI land at this point. And then I came home around Thanksgiving, end of November. I think I got back on Thanksgiving. And then they began filming a week or two later. I think Ariana got COVID and that delayed filming by a week. Then they shot for about a year, maybe a little more than a year. And I was working constantly on tweaking arrangements and beginning, um like the changes that were coming were daily. Like this is the wrong key, this is the wrong tempo. Steven would write, he'd have new ideas. There were some new songs that showed up. Um, and then there was the writer's strike, which went on for several months. And then there was an actor's strike, and we weren't allowed to work at all. And it was serious. We could not work on it. So I had some time off and I was able to see my family. We traveled a little bit. Um, and then as soon as that was over, we had that Zoom meeting when we were trying to schedule just going to London to record the London studio musicians who were going to play drums and bass and guitar and keyboards. And that's when Stephen Schwartz put his hand up. It's like, no, 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 I'm sorry, there's a misunderstanding. Greg is the band. And then that work began. Um, and looking back on it, like before the strike, I'm trying to figure out why there was so much work for me to do in the world of MIDI, because I hadn't played one bit of real instruments at that point. But it was nonstop. I was constantly delivering new mixes of new arrangements. Um, it never let up. It was just the pedal was down the whole time.
So is the
Uh,
way that it would work was you would deliver this MIDI arrangement, they would go on set and sing to it, and at some point maybe they go, you know what, this arrangement's not working. We need to stop for the day. Maybe they stop for the day, and they say, Greg, we need you to change this element of it to fit the movie, and then you go home, change the element, send it back, and then they keep shooting the scene. Is that kind of how it worked? And would stuff literally just stop because they would say, this is not the right part. We actually need something else, and you would go fix it before they could keep shooting that scene?
no, I mean you have the right idea. There was a lot of it would never get to the point where they'd be on set like ready to shoot or ready to rehearse a thing, and then they realize the music's not working. It's so planned out. They would find out that it isn't what they need before they get to that point with like the actors ready to go. but yes, there was a lot of notes from the director or from the choreographer or both saying, this is what we're looking for, or we need 16 more bars of music in this scene because this bit has been extended, or we need a minute more of music. I think that's a lot of what I was doing before the strike. Uh, yeah, there's a lot of like, glorified vamping, but we couldn't just vamp. Like we couldn't just repeat stuff. And that's a real bone of contention, especially with Steven Schwartz. He hates it when things just repeat. He hates it when things are sort of phoned in and lazy. He always wants things to develop and um, have surprises happening. So there was a lot of that. Yeah, a lot of and there were a few things we got not stuck on, but we didn't know what was going to work. We didn't know what they were looking for, and we kept trying and trying and trying. Dancing Through Life, which I think is a 10-hour segment in the movie, was the bone of it's just like the absolute it drove me crazy because I didn't have a feel for it. Um, I didn't I just didn't get it. I didn't get it. And um the bass line threw me. The original bass line threw me. And I anyway, there were a few songs but I really did not know what to do with. That was one of them.
This one
And
I felt like the arrangement was almost modernized a little bit, or it had that kind of syncopated, not syncopated, like that repeating almost it sounded like a synth, like this looping synth line that was playing like the do 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 like that part, which I don't think is in the Broadway cast. And to me, it made it feel a little more modern. Is that the part that you're referencing that you almost struggled with, or what was the bass line that you couldn't get?
no, that was the thing that unlocked the door, that actually kicked the door down. So when Dancing Through Life was really like a huge blunt thorn in my side for so long, and I just felt like a big dummy. I just couldn't. I felt so bad. Kept telling the two Stevens like, I'm so sorry. I don't know how to make this sound right. And then we get to the point where I was the rhythm section, so I was playing the bass, and I couldn't even play the bass in a way to make that dun 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 dun. I just couldn't make it sound right. So I thought, fuck, I'm gonna make this work. Like, so it took me like 6 hours or maybe it's 7, 8 hours, and I just kept going and going by myself in my studio on this beautiful bass, and I just pushed myself, and I finally got it to where I thought, this feels great. This sounds the way I want it to sound. Lots of punching in. I just lots of like editing the timing. I couldn't play it with the timing I was looking for. Normally that's not a problem for me, but something about this line just like did not jive with my DNA. I just could not come through me. But I got it sounding right. And I sent it to them and they loved it. And the next day, Stephen Aremus called me. He's like, you know what? Greg, you know how you've been saying you hate the bass line? I'm like, yes, but it's never sounded better now. He's like, well, that's true, but you know what? I think I think you're right. I think we should ditch the bass line. What? After all the hell I just went through, he's like, I know, but I think we should ditch the bass line. I said, well, isn't Stephen Schwartz going to have a heart attack? He's like, no, I don't think so. I think let's just see what happens. And I had a little short-term frustration just because of my whatever, because I'd spent a day really banging my head against the wall and I felt like I'd solved it. But as soon as he said that, I just felt like a boulder lift off my shoulders. And then I could kind of like get more modern with it. And it became, I felt like I could run with it at that point. There's something about, if you if you see a band or if you're playing in a band and the bass player is just sort of in their own world, or if they're not a very good bass player, if they're playing the wrong notes, if whatever, if there's some issue with the bass that you don't jive with, you can't save it, right? If the bass, it's just if the bass is doing a thing that you think is the wrong thing, there's no saving it. I'm not saying that this bass part was the wrong. Clearly, no one's had a problem with the bass part for 20 years. It's a big favorite of people's in the show. Whatever is my problem, I don't know. I couldn't make the bass line work, but as soon as Arima said that to me, I was like, oh God, thank you. And in Stephen Schwartz's mind, that song, even though to me it doesn't really sound anything like it, but he was inspired by the Sting, the Police song, Every Breath You Take. That's what he was feeling when he wrote Dancing Through Life. Even though Dancing Through Life has a zillion chord changes in it in a way that Every Breath You Take doesn't. But he was hearing that sort of like that kind of groove, that sort of like, so I thought, all right, well, I'm going to kind of come up with a guitar thing like that. And I started just kind of playing the bass line, but on guitar with sort of an Andy Summers vibe. And that was interesting. And then I started, I don't know, whatever you hear in the final version, that is really just me sort of like the next, after that phone call with Aremus, I'm like, thank you. Just messing around, improvising. And there was all this momentum with it at that point, and everyone thankfully liked it. And then I just played the roots on bass. Just kind of drove and gave the drums just like a pumping beat, and it just started flying. Then everyone liked it, and that's how it sounds now.
Is there like a repeated like 16th note, almost like synth line that happens throughout it, or is it was
Yeah, I it's I've for years I've loved that sound. I love one of my favorite things that synthesizers have brought into the world is almost like that as a percussion element, like kind of almost a flat like sine wave sound, but use it as a like a 16th note. And I like it just as a single repeated note. Some people just turn on the arpeggiator function and just play a chord. I don't do that. I actually wind up playing the part in, and I quite often will double track it and play a different part on the other side with a slightly different sound, so that both things are happening. Makes it very stereo. There's a really funny moment if when you see the film. Um, I had some fun panning that stuff around. There's one moment where if you sit near the back row, one of those percolating synth things is hilariously isolated and loud coming out of one of the rear speakers. It's like the only thing coming out of the rear speaker. It's a bit it's a bit of a whoops moment, but if you're sitting in the middle of the theater, it sounds great. If you buy that speaker, it's a kind of a synth solo. But I do love that sound. Jack Antonoff does it a lot with Taylor Swift. It's all through the 80s pop music. It's not a new device, but it's a sound that I love.
was there any conversation about those opening arpeggios on the electric guitar with the rotary effect that I don't think is in the final, that's in the cast recording, but I don't think is in the musical? Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you know what I'm referencing? The
That's just no, it's just a sound I came up with.
Yeah.
Um uh oh, there is some kind of backstory on that. That sound is a replacement for Stephen Schwartz had requested a wah guitar. I think I'm right in this story. He'd requested that I play some sort of like wah wah effect, and I did. And we played that for John, our director, and he really bumped on it. He didn't like it, and he liked all the piano stuff, but he thought that was just it's way too distracting. Um, and he said, "Can you try?" He's like, "I don't mind it sounding a bit affected, but that's too much." And so then I went back to the drawing board and I just put a Leslie on it. Um, and never heard a complaint about it again at that point. And yeah, that's how that happened.
So what work still has to be done for the second movie?
Um, all the live instruments and Jeff Admagian, the incredible Jeff Admagian. Maybe he started already. He has to write his orchestral arrangements. Um, and I am going to start. I've already been sent clips for the second movie, some songs, uh, No Good Deed, and a couple of others. and I'm going to start to sink my teeth into it. It's a different vibe, the second movie, as is the second act in the live version. You know, John Chu has been saying in interviews the first movie is about choices. The second movie is more about the consequences of those choices. So it's definitely darker. There's no popular. There's no song like popular in the second movie. Um, I can't wait to attack No Good Deed. The MIDI version of it is was nuts. I spent days and days and days on it. That's one where I really tried to make that sound like a real orchestra. And actually that's the one where we fooled some conductors. I'm whatever. It's fun for me. Um, it's such brilliant part. The parts in that are so good. And that all comes from Stephen Schwartz's piano. He was playing every note of that on piano. Um, there's a beautiful song called For Good that's incredible. The rehearsal studio version that we got of that is just, everyone is bawling by the end. The girls singing it. It's ridiculous. And, you know, it really is sung live on set, which is the first thing that John said to me when I met him. I got to work with John on In the Heights. So when we had our first production meeting with it was me, Stephen Schwartz, Stephen Remus, John Chu, Mark Platt, and Mike Knobloch, who's the head of film music from Universal. That was it. It's just what was that, six people, something like that. And I I came in and I saw John and he's like, it's so nice to see a familiar face here, and because we've done Heights together, and one of the first things he said was, I really want the singers to be singing live on camera. I don't want it to be lip sync if possible. And I'm like, I know we can do that. I'm sure we can do that. And especially with knowing such great singers that they are, but there's definitely a thing that happens. It's one thing to have them in front of like a, fantastic vintage 47 or 67 in a studio, but to have that thing going on when they're in character and on the set, it does bring another thing to it. It's a little less controlled sonically, but that doesn't matter. I can deal with that. Um, I just can't wait to get into that music. I always like the darker music anyway because there's something wrong with me.
This is such an insane work. I can't even imagine taking this on. Like, I watched the movie and I thought, oh my God, it would be so fun to get in and work with this music. And then I would think, like, I'm a musician, but I was like, I don't have the toolkit to do this. Like, I think you're right. Who else can handle this the way you were able to come in and handle it?
Well, I'm not saying that arrogantly, and I'm sure
No,
there's somebody else.
I know what you're saying though.
I'm sure there's somebody else that could do it, but I don't know who it is actually. I mean, and I'm hanging on by the skin of my teeth, by the way. Like there's a reason that I have barely seen my family. I am not phoning this shit in. Like I'm really, my hair is grayer than it's ever been. Like I mean, uh, it's intense. It's intense, and it was definitely a pleasant, a surreal, but a pleasant, cathartic experience to get to go to the premiere in LA and hear 3,000 people react to the movie in a similar way that I had been reacting to it for the most part by myself, looking at a computer monitor, um, not really knowing how people were going to react to it. It's so weird. It's so weird what we do as musicians. It's I say to people, like, it's a combination of being very selfless in that you have to share music, you have to share art, you have to share storytelling, or that you're not really telling a story. But so that's very selfless, but you have to also be very selfish to really like hone your craft and be good at it. To really, hopefully achieve some level of mastery. You gotta focus. You have to woodshed. You have to not be out partying. You have to practice. You have to get good. And it's that weird thing of like hiding away and being, very insular and introverted, and then like, hello, everyone try the cake. Um, anyway, but that's very nice of you to say. I'm sure there's other people out there that could do it, but I don't know. You know, by the way, I can't do it. I can't figure out the tip in a restaurant. Like
Me too.
I really,
I struggle with that, Greg. I
it's
struggle with that
hard.
too.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
appreciate, I like hearing that.
I've heard you say in interviews that you really try to focus on this thing when you're working with a rock band, which is you want the playback, you want everything to sound like a record, even in the studio, because it puts the band at ease to go, this is going well. This already sounds like a record. This is working. Any strategy or tips like that that you had to use on this show or this movie, or were the MIDI files your version of that, of just saying, listen to this and how good it already sounds, and this is just MIDI? Did any of that thought process have to come in for this movie?
It comes in with everything I do. Everything I do. And it all stems back to me being a session musician in the 90s. Um, we just watched so many times, um, before audio was recorded to computers, when I was playing on sessions in the first half of the 90s, it was tape, and it was a console, and it was analog gear. And so if you're in the middle of working on something over a period of whatever, several days or weeks or whatever, you have a balance. You have your faders on the console set to different levels, and you just call that the board mix. And you're not really dialing in effects, and you're not EQing things. It's just like a rough balance. It does not sound like the finished record. And you have to use some imagination. It's where that phrase "will fix it in the mix." That's where that came from, because they really did mean it. Like this is a different phase of the recording. Um, but I saw even then, even though that is the way that everything was done, people would be underwhelmed or even turned off something that was potentially really good just because it didn't sound it tasted like an unbaked cake, to make the cake reference again. But if it just had a bit of zhuzh on it, we just spent like even an hour building a nice rough mix, put some stuff on it, just even put some stuff across the master mix bus. That would help a lot. And I saw the difference that made. I saw a couple of great engineers say, "Can I just clear the room just for an hour? Just give me an hour. Let me just put something together." And then people would come back in and go, "Oh my God, that's the same track? Really?" Is almost night and day. So presentation of everything is important. And I've learned the hard, hard, hard way as a record producer that presenting an idea to a room, the idea itself is hardly ever the issue. It's all about the presentation. If I say, um, if somebody whatever plays the wrong chord or suggests something that is so clearly a really boneheaded idea that's not going to help, uh, but they are the artist. So in a way, they are in charge, even though they've hired me to be in charge, but really they're in charge, or kind of we're both in charge. I could be goofy and say, "Oh my God, that was terrible. We need to do this. Or give me the guitar. Let's do this." And there's lots of producers who play instruments who do act like that. And the artist either fires them when they do that, or they're like, "Okay," and they're okay being sort of demeaned like that. Or you could say, "Can, listen, can I just try something?" Like, and I might be wrong about this, but can I just let me see, tell me what you think of this. And that's what I do all the time, which by the way is true. I never know if something's good until I hear it. I can hear it in my head, but it's not until I hear it, and actually it's not until I hear it through speakers that I can really tell if it works or not. Um, but if you present it that way, in a humble way, or being Canadians, like everything's an apology. So um people will follow me kind of anywhere. But if I come off like I know what's best, everyone thinks I'm a dick. And anyway. So presentation of music, people are so like the bar is so high, even for terrible songs, they all sound good. Even a terrible mix today still sounds pretty good. Um, and there's never been more technology out there for people who aren't probably very good at mixing to make things sound pretty good. I mean, I've made software that helps people make better mixes. Um, and I watched even when we're playing things for John Chu, who is no dummy. I mean, I think he's one of the best film directors going. If we played him something that was like we did a thing when we were at Air Studios with the orchestra. We'd be working long days. Now, he's in California, we're in London. That's an 8-hour time change. So we're fried. It's 8 o'clock at night. We're all complete. We've lost all our objectivity. The orchestra is insanely loud at this point in the mix because we have to listen that way. My rhythm track is probably 10 dB too quiet to listen as a balanced mix. We don't really know that at this point because we've lost, we've that's what we've been listening to all day long. John zooms in he's on a Zoom call. He wants to hear what we've done. And we're playing him, and we're not idiots, but this is not the way to do that. And I knew that, but I also know that, he's directing the movie. He's got to hear what's going on. And we played him something and it wasn't balanced. We tried quickly to balance it. It wasn't very good. And he immediately is like, what happened to like, why is it? And he was saying like, why doesn't it sound right? He, he wanted, it's like, he's wondering why doesn't it sound like a finished thing? I mean, of course he knows it wasn't a finished thing, but the reaction, and I would react the same way. Like what happened? Because he'd heard the version before with my fake orchestra that sounded really convincing. Um, and now it just sounds like all kind of blown out. And the orchestra sounds amazing, but now it sounds like it's lost all of its power. I don't
So
quite know
wait,
what
so
I'm saying.
what do you say to instill confidence to basically say, just go with us? It's going to work. How do you get that message across?
Really, my opinion is there is nothing you can say because, uh, you know, I don't think I could have more respect for him as a director. And when you're a movie director or a record producer or really anybody involved in this movie, the editor, Steven Schwartz, Stephen Ramis, like we all really trust our instincts. That's probably why we wound up, being involved with this thing to begin with. So, like, I have to imagine that John's got to feel like he's got to feel like he feels it's right. So if he feels it's wrong, I don't think anyone can convince him it's right. And I'm okay with that because I understand that. I understand that. And then when he hears it sounding right, I feel like it's my job to present the thing to him that sounds right. And we finally got to that place. He was hearing a lot of preview mixes, and complaining about the low end being way too boomy. And it was not boomy for me where I was mixing or anybody else. But every time he heard something with like drums and bass, the note was always, it's way too bottom end. It's way too boomy. And none of us knew what was going on. And I have to imagine maybe he was sitting too close to the back wall where it becomes a bass trap. And, the minute he was on a proper dub stage and hearing the mixes, that note completely went away. And, and I had a feeling that maybe that would happen. It doesn't matter. It's like he has so much on his plate, and the music is one component of this movie. Um, so I'm trying to answer your question. Like it, there's a reason why I always want things to sound as real world as possible. because the danger of not doing that is, at the very least, you can have a manager walk into a recording studio in 1993 and go, I'm not sure if this song is as good as everybody says it is. Or in 2024, you can have John M. Chu, one of the best directors working today, on the most expensive movie musical ever made, which might wind up becoming a legendary movie. I don't know, maybe. I mean, it kind of looks like it's headed that way. Going, why does the music not sound right? Looking at me and Stephen Remus, and we're like, I mean, so, had we had another 2 hours to balance it, we wouldn't have had that reaction. Now, Andy Nelson, who is beautiful human being, and he was the re-recording mixer on this movie. And for anyone that doesn't know what that means, he's the all the audio. He's the final uh, gatekeeper of that. So, like everything, the dialogue, all of my music tracks, all of the sound effects, the wind, the whatever, the explosions, anything you hear, he is has his hand on the gear shift of that. And he has, he's won a couple of Oscars. He's been nominated, I think, for 24 Oscars. He's just fantastic. He's mixed so many legendary movies, and he's really a lovely guy. And I would kind of confidentially, I would confide in him and say some of the stuff because I'm new to movies. I think I've only been involved with about 5 movies before this one. And he would just say, Greg, it doesn't matter. Like, we're going to fix all this by the end. It doesn't matter. Like, I understand it's bothering you right now, but we're going to get past this. And to me, it felt like this is always going to be this way because I'm very reactive. He's like, it won't be. It's going to be great. And he was right, and we had breakfast recently, and he said, he'd seen the movie recently and he heard all these things that he wished he'd done differently. And he asked me if I felt the same. I'm like, yeah, of course. Like, I've listened to the soundtrack. There's things I wished I'd done in the mix that I just didn't have time to get to, even though we spent a lot of time on it. And he said, you know what I've realized? Um, there's always going to be another bus. Like, there's always another bus coming. And it's hard for me to feel that way. He's a bit older than me. Um, and certainly in movies, he's way more experienced than I am. But there's something really beautiful about that. Like, I can take a bit of a deep breath and just kind of chill out. Like, there will be another bus. It's hard when you're a musician to feel that way because it's hard to make money as a musician. It took me a long time to embrace the word no because I said yes to everything forever. It's partly why my discography is so nuts because you can kind of tell, well, looking at my discography, when I started saying no and when I wasn't saying no, because it's a bunch of like, really? What? Um, but it was coming from this like place of I don't know how I'm gonna pay, you know, my credit card bill. Um, I'm now answering questions you have clearly not asked.
Greg, this was so insightful and such a thrill. Are there any Easter eggs, musical moments, any moments that still give you chills that we haven't covered that should just get out there on record from the movie?
It's, you know, I think there's Easter eggs that no one's ever going to uncover because Steven Schwartz runs so deep. Is that what you mean? Like kind of musical
It could be
wink?
musical, it could be anything, anything across the spectrum that you just love, or a moment you loved on set, or something musical that you're really proud of. Is there anything else that we should pay a little closer attention to when it passes us by in the movie?
Um, two things come to mind. I was talking about that Fender 6, old Nashville Fender 6 bass, which is basically sort of like a jazz master, but an octave down, kind of. Sort of looks like a big jazz master. So there's this moment in Defying Gravity just before Cynthia rips into the final big double time chorus, which she's really belting. And in the movie, it's when she starts like flying around and the flying monkeys are following her. I think it's like is it an E flat minor? Maybe it's an E minor. I can't remember. I do these slides, these octave slides. And it's like intentionally a bit out of tune, especially when it goes up to the high octave because it's from the 60s, so the intonation's a bit off. And I think I triple tracked it. And it's all distorted, but it's you really hear it in the immersive mix. It really pops out. It makes me chuckle. It's like it's a bit loud, but no one asked me to turn it down. It's loud on the soundtrack and the stereo mix too. I can't believe they let me keep it in there, but I love that they did. I love that Steven Schwartz is cool with it. No one's even ever mentioned it. That always makes me chuckle when I hear it, but I meant it. I like that it's there. I feel like it sets it up. At the other end of the musical spectrum, and I actually just posted about this on Instagram. Uh, Probably the most musically sensitive moment in the movie that makes me cry even thinking about it is that awful fucking moment when Elphaba is tricked into wearing the hat and she comes down the stairs and she realizes, oh shit, you're just trying to, make fun of me in front of everybody. And then Glinda, feels terrible because she was given the wand, and so she comes out and they start dancing together. And there's this really there's a piano. One of my favorite kind of piano sounds is rolling off all the high end, like really sharply filtering it, not gentle, but like kind of a 18 dB curve down to like I don't know 2K, sometimes a bit lower, sometimes 900 hertz. You have to play with it depending on what the notes are. If you go too low, you're going to lose the high notes. But um, and I very luckily once got to work with Imogen Heap, incredible artist Imogen Heap, who's a sweetheart and insanely gifted and talented and super smart. And she's a real whiz with Pro Tools. Um, and she showed me this trick. It's not really a trick. It's a thing that she does where you can take a piano part and duplicate the piano part. And using the Pro Tools users will know what I mean by this. You use tap to transient to create edit regions between each chord, or if it's a single note part, whatever. Anytime there's a transient, then you hit Command E each time. Tap to transient, Command E, tap to transient, Command E, and just keep going all the way to get to the end. And then you highlight that whole duplicated track with all the different regions now. Then you go to reverse audio suite, select reverse, and don't do entire region. You change that to clip by clip. Hit reverse, and each clip gets flipped around, but it's still sequentially in order, right? With the way it was played. And then you might have to shift that a little bit. I usually have to shift it a little earlier in the timeline, but it is the coolest sounding effect. So like every note has the actual note reversing into it or a chord. It is so cool. And I use it all over the place. It's all over so many productions of mine. I use it constantly. Not on every song, but I use it a lot. It's an amazing thing. And I always credit her for it. I talk about it all the time. But if you listen carefully, it's not really, I mixed it really low. I wanted it to not be distracting, but it's happening all over that really subtle piano. And there's no other sound at that moment. It's just the piano. And I gave her credit on Instagram, my little Instagram account. And I was just talking to her the other day, or we were texting each other. And I said, remember that reverse piano trick you showed me? I did it in in the scene in the Ozdesk Ball, and she's like, "What reverse piano trick?"
She doesn't even know.
She just forgot. I mean, she probably has so many crazy, brilliant techniques. She's so smart. She's like, I have like probably 500 things like that that I do. But anyway, those are some fun moments for me. And then, sorry, I will shut up. My answer's been so long. And then just, I'm really proud of the drumming on it. And I will say that the Steven Remus in particular, really pushed me to drum more. Like there were plenty of drum fills on it, and he's like, it's not enough. And there were so many times where he said, I want you to go crazier, to the point where I was like, really? It's gonna wreck it. He's like, just please just try it, just go crazier. And I'm so glad that he did. And he was right. He just working with him, who has been on Wicked from day one with Stephen Schwartz, you know, like over 20 years ago. He just has such a sense of what it needs to feel like, but he's also, just like Stephen Schwartz, he's very open to making it feel new, but he also knows how it how not to break it. So those guys are making me look really good, and I'm very grateful to have worked with both of them.
Greg Wells, the music producer behind the Wicked movie, that what you just said is why I think this is resonating so much, because it is so faithful to the original recordings, but so updated and so fresh at the same time. Greg Wells, who walked out at the end of Act One the first time he saw Wicked, look at him now producing the music to the movie. Why did you walk out, Greg? I still don't understand that. You just couldn't handle the greatness of it. What's that about?
You really want to go there?
I don't know. Do we?
I think I think it resonated with me in a very subconscious way. It spoke to, I've had a version of that happen to me where there was a there was an amazing music teacher in Toronto, and Toronto's like the New York of Canada. And this guy would come to my little hometown, Peterborough, and he would adjudicate music festivals. Really impressive, like brilliant, and a great teacher. He's great, amazing. Um, and I wound up going to the college that he was at, and he wound up being the head of the college while I was there. And I wound up playing in his band and getting kind of close to him. And I realized he hated me and wanted to fucking ruin my career. It was gross. It really did my head in. Like he was, it was just messed up. And it was like, I really kind of viewed him as sort of the Wizard of Oz in a way. I'm not saying I'm Alphaba. I was like, this is ridiculous, but I had like my own, Canadian stars in my eyes from a small town. Like I really viewed this guy as like someone I wanted to be like. And then I realized he was actually like a really, really, really messed up, bitter dude. Um, and it did my head in, and I'm like, oh, okay, what was that? And I just had to kind of like, I've had a lot, I had kind of a rough time growing up. I couldn't wait to leave my hometown. I was very not accepted. I got beat up for my best friend was very gay. He got beat up a lot too, but I got beat up a lot just because I was a musician. I didn't fit in. It was a very rednecky. The town is actually quite cool now, but at the time it was terrible. Um, and it was easy to leave. I used to have a real chip on my shoulder about that. And in the last few years, I actually view it as a real gift because it made it easy to travel 3,000 miles to come to Los Angeles, which professionally is without question the best thing I've ever done. The career that I have, the bizarre career that I have, could not, I don't think it could happen anywhere else. It just couldn't. LA is just a weird place with the confluence of all the content being created here, where the record business is here, the movie business is here, television is here, every other content creation company, most of them are here. So, in a way, it's like it was a blessing to just it was so easy to go bye-bye. Um, there's so many things I miss about Canada. Canada's an amazing place. It's not anti-Canada for me to say that. Uh, anyway, so when I saw that, like I really got, anyone that feels like an underdog or feels unaccepted really resonates. And I think every human being on earth doesn't feel like they fit in. It's probably why this movie is really connecting. That's my guess. That's my armchair psychiatrist guess.
Greg, thank you so much for taking the time, being so generous with your answers, with your stories about this movie. There was so much I didn't even get the chance to ask you about. If you ever come back on again, I have to ask you about Life in a Cartoon Motion Picture by Mika, one of my favorite pop albums of all time. Genuinely. I have to ask you about how you convinced One Republic to record Apologize because they didn't want to do it, and you convinced them to do it, Greg. There's so much we didn't cover, but I think we have to leave it there for now because that was so great. Thank you so much for taking the time. From a cold Instagram DM, Greg, you came on, and I appreciate it, and I can't wait to see part two. And
I
I
have
hope
to
our
say it's one of
paths
the
cross
best.
again.
It's one of the best cold DMs I've ever got. And I'll leave you with this. Here's how weird life is, and possibly proof that time is not linear. At least proof in my little narcissistic world. 10, 11 years ago, maybe at this point, working with Mika. Um, and that record changed my producer career. That was the first big hit I had as a producer, Life in Cartoon Motion, that album, Grace Kelly, the song. Um, and I was the band on that. I think maybe that's Steven Schwartz is a fan of that record, and I wound up introducing those two. And Mika wrote a song called Popular Song, and he had seen Wicked way before I did. And he wrote a song where the verses were totally different, but the chorus was the chorus of Popular. And he said, I'll never be able to get clearance on this. And I said, well, actually, I know the composer. I've been friends with him for a long time. Why don't I could send the song to him and maybe anyways. So Steven Schwartz said, I love it. Go ahead. And and then Steven was out in LA and he came by my studio and he met Mika and we all hung out. I had pictures of that day. And then Universal Republic, the label, said, there's this girl, she's on a TV show on Nickelodeon. We think she's gonna be huge. Her name is Ariana Grande. We think she should sing this as a duet with Mika. And we're like, okay. And so I produced Ariana singing Popular a decade ago. And the first thing that she and I said to each other was, isn't this bizarre? Like, you're producing me again singing Popular, but this time she's Glinda. Like, it's so bizarre for both of us. It doesn't make it like, what are the odds of that happening? I don't know. It's so weird.
I know that exact recording, and I did not put that together. And you're so right. That is insane. That is so bizarre.
So weird. It's so weird. I don't know. I don't know why I felt like I had to bring that up. Well, you brought Mika up, and I just yeah, bizarre. Life is weird. Life in cartoon motion.
That is such a great record. That is such a crazy fact, too. I didn't even think about that, but you're right. That is so bizarre. That's the
It's
only
the
word.
first thing she and I talked about. Like, yeah. I mean, literally, like, who knew? Anyway, sorry, I'm talking way too much.
Greg, this was so fun. I enjoyed it so much. Thank you so much for taking the time, and I hope our paths cross again soon.
Thank you, Zach. All right, take care.